It's a pleasure to be here with this really distinguished panel. I hope to have a great conversation for about an hour, and we'll look forward to the questions all of you are going to have for us as well. As you all know, we're going to be talking about negotiations and conflict in professional sports. We'll probably jump around from league to league, NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL. Every one of them has given us some data to look at when it comes to conflicts. And whether you're a sports fan or not, you notice that there seems to be a fair amount of conflict. Anytime there's supposed to be a new CBA, there is some conflict, and often enough conflict that we start destroying some serious revenues. So $1 billion here, $2 billion there before we can get a deal that in retrospect looks like, well, why couldn't they have gotten it from the very beginning? Nothing magical has really happened between now and then. So we're going to be trying to dig into why this happens and what sort of insights we can glean from the causes of these lockouts, what kinds of negotiations take place, the tactics that make things better, the things that make things worse, and then see if we can extract some lessons that maybe would help folks going forward in these kinds of negotiations. And my job as moderator is quite simple. It's just to get the discussion going. The way I'm going to try to do this is I'm going to try to maximize the amount of insights we can extract from these four folks up here, and try to make it that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And your job will be to help us do that with the questions that you have. So if the conversation for the first 45 minutes isn't to your liking, if there's questions that you think we missed, if there's anything you want to hear, that's your job, all right? So we're sort of in it together. I'll start out with a question to one person, and then anybody else who wants to jump in can jump in on that topic. And when it seems like we're ready to move on to something else, I'll interject as well. So that's how we're going to do this. So I'm going to start out with a question to Andy here. The most basic question, which is when one of these negotiations spirals out of control, and there is a lockout, and games are getting canceled, and the fans are getting upset, and you ask folks, why do you think that's happening? The most common reaction is of the kind, well, it's millionaires and billionaires fighting with each other. It's a combination of greed and incompetence, and that's what's really driving the problem here. We need different people running these negotiations. And from your point of view, certainly that could be a factor. Are there other factors? What would you consider to be the most important factors that lead to situations that turn out into value-destroying lockouts rather than perhaps tough but reasonably well-resolved negotiations?
Now, I'll go with greed and incompetence. Not really. So I think that fundamentally what happens when there is a work stoppage is that there is an economic problem in the league, a financial problem. It can be an aggregate problem, like I think has been the case with the NHL in recent years, or it can be a distributional problem, or both. The distributional problems is when some teams are making a lot of money and there's some teams aren't making very much money, and there's conflict amongst the owners. On top of those two issues, you have the issues of personalities. So when you have a turnover in the commissioner's office, or you have a turnover in the Players Association, very often, number one, there's not trust between the two sides. There's not good communication between the two sides. And the new leaders want to establish themselves and show what a good job they're going to do for their constituents. So those three factors, I think, either deep-seated aggregate economic issues, distributional issues amongst the owners, or personalities in the leadership are, in my view, the main causes of why we have work stoppages.
Anybody want to add anything? Anything else that strikes you as a key problem in any particular lockout that you've seen, or more generally?
I agree with Andy, and I think adding to that, the leagues and the players' associations have sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of the litigation process, where they view courts as a potential remedy for their structural labor debate. And the reality is that the litigation process takes too long. That we've seen that in the lockouts, that filing an antitrust case is usually a matter that will take years to resolve. And there's no way the league is going to be out of operations or that players can withstand that type of delay in receiving pay. So I think, I don't want to say they abuse the courts, but they both treat the courts as an instrument, and I don't think it's as effective as they foresee it. And also they're relying on old law, the Norris LaGuardia Act, an act that people don't often talk about. A 1930s law rises to the forefront, and it's used in an application that was never intended into the context of professional sports. So I think the whole use of the law is a matter that hopefully the next time around, both the league and the Players Association take in a more sophisticated way.
But it sometimes seems, though, that when it gets to the point where the legal tactics are really picking up steam, it can also lead to some resolution. I mean, if you're starting to put pressure on it. So I mean, is it bad that they start out thinking legalistically about it, or is it that eventually things get so out of control they know they have that as a backstop, and so they let the fight go on? I mean,
Yeah, I think I think that's part of it, and I also think it brought different people to the table, right? After they lock out, and there's no longer a union, if we want to go along with that, then lawyers enter the room, and they're part of the negotiation, and that technically the union becomes a trade association and shouldn't be negotiating a CBA. And I do think that probably helped in the context of the NBA. I'm not sure how much it helped in the context of the NFL. I think that's a different scenario. And I would defer to the experts, including yourself, on how negotiations work. But I would say that by adding lawyers, it helped. But I don't know if that result was necessary. They could have reached that agreement months earlier, and lots of people who had no seat at the bargaining table, businesses that were affected, agents that were affected, wouldn't have lost, in some cases, a significant amount of money.
I guess I would say two things. One, I think the lack of a monolithic view on both sides contributes to it. That is, when you're negotiating with people on your own side as well as negotiating with people on the other side, that greatly complicates the negotiations. I think it means you have to take actions in the bilateral negotiations between the union and the league, not so much to further those negotiations, but to also further your agenda within your own organization. I think that plays a role. And I think that's why Andy talked about, sort of disparities and particularly on the owner side can make things more difficult. I would say in terms of the legal threats, I think they do push you toward a solution, because it's kind of, Armageddon there. You're sort of staring that in the face and you say, look, legal solution is very long, very complicated, costly, and the rest. Not surprisingly, you get solutions when you start staring that in the face. And I think it's more the threat of that than it is the actual change of who was in the room or whatever. It's the threat that things will get out of control that helps get you a resolution at that point.
But that suggests that maybe one of the problems is that we cancel games one at a time, or 1 week at a time, or 2 weeks at a time. If we were forced to cancel games a season at a time, the moment things were spiraling out of control, you would suggest that would put the kind of pressure that would, well, it could doom it, but it may actually tip things in favor of a resolution.
I think that's what economics tells us about negotiations, that
and
you make progress when you're forced to, when the consequences get large. It's not surprising that football scheduled, I mean, they reached a decision right before the season started. It's not surprising this year that basketball, in 2011, basketball got a deal that allowed the season to go on when it was pretty much getting toward the brink.
Yeah.
Hockey did the same this time around. I mean, the last time with hockey, they didn't achieve that. I don't think that's that surprising. And I think we got that far along in the process because there was, and I know in the NBA case, there was a lot of changes in the environment that fostered disagreements of opinion on both sides and within both sides. And I think that was a big part of getting us to where we ended up.
Well, one more data point on that. If you think back to the National Hockey League lockouts, this last one, we lost half a season. The one before that, we lost a full season. But you go back 20 years, the first work stoppage in 1992 was a strike. And it only lasted 10 days. And then a deal was reached. And if you ask yourself, well, why did that one only take 10 days? And these others have taken half a year or a year. The difference is that that strike took place in April, right before the playoffs.
Yes.
And the players got everything they wanted. Because players get paid, every few weeks. Owners make a lot of their money during the playoffs. So if you're going to strike, you strike when you're going to put maximum pain on the other side. But of course, the consequence of that is, after that one strike, the owners learned you never let it get that far. And that's why we've had lockouts every time instead of strikes. Because if we let them go, then they might strike later in the season. So there is this sort of unraveling, and maybe it goes back to this question of trust and who you're dealing with, because people seem to be doing things to sort of get an edge, whether it's their personalities or it's a lack of trust or the wrong people are in the room. How do we think about that as a problem to be solved, right? So if the wrong people are in the room, can they be replaced in a reasonable way? Can other voices be brought in? Is there a way to build the level of trust you need to make that process go a little bit more smoothly so you don't have to sacrifice revenues in order to get a deal. Any thoughts on that? I mean, have you seen
You keep focusing on sacrificing revenues. I mean, they're really fighting over a bigger revenue pool that ends up getting split more favorably, and then franchise valuations follow, right? So, I mean, that short-term pain is totally worth the long-term gain for either side that's grabbing at it. It's particularly from the ownership side where they've made such advances in these last series of agreements. And you go to trust, I mean, my thought was on the art of consensus building. I mean, Kevin, the complexity of what you guys deal with on the player side is just as dynamic as what those owners are dealing with. And these leverage points that you talk about, my mind went to back when Jerry West in the NBA All-Star game was part of that group that refused to go. That's how the NBA union got formed. Those guys refused to go play in the All-Star game. And the owner said, we demand you play in the All-Star game. He said, we're not doing it. And the game was going to start. They had a contract with CBS, I think was televising it. So how do you get to trust? You talked about trust, and then you talk about ultimately consensus building, and it's really, really challenging here with the complexities of trying to. There's so much distrust within each side, particularly the player side, because the players don't put their focus on this. I mean, you can speak maybe to what you try to do to get those guys even engaged, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Getting them engaged is, not surprising. You have 400 players. They have their, what's most important to them is their career. They have a short career. They need to be successful in that career. It's not that they're not interested, they don't care. It's they have a lot of other things that are on their mind, and they're just a large number of them. In terms of change, I want to get back to something that was talked about, which is changing who's in the room. I think it's really difficult to have a process that makes that a strong possibility, because that would then feed back into the way negotiations work. You might say, well, after the fact, I'd like to change who's there. But if you leave that possibility open, it's going to really change the bargaining dynamics, because you get somebody in there you don't want, you have an incentive to try to get them pushed out. So I think you got to think real hard before you'd want to allow that to happen on the fly. I think that tells you got to do your homework beforehand. And this is one place I think we can do better. And this is really apropos of this conference, because we know a lot about what helps teams be successful and make teams win. That's really been the focus of sports analytics. I think for natural reasons, we've paid less attention to what makes leagues better. And one of the conflicts we had in negotiating with the league was just disagreements over what was the best way to run a league. How much player mobility should there be? How much flexibility should there be for teams to move players or get better? What's the optimal amount of competitive balance? What really makes the league better? And sports analytics focus on what helps teams win, but in the aggregate, you're going to win 50% of the games no matter how good we get at figuring out how to win. What really can add money to the bottom line is figuring out what makes leagues better. And that really feeds back into negotiations, because we know that if you can add value, that is something that makes both sides, make the pie bigger, that's the easiest way to get a settlement, because everybody can meet their expectations in that world. And I think one of the things I think we need to do better job of, and between the players associations, the leagues, but also just people interested in sports in general, is figure out how we need to improve the system and what the CBA can do to make that better.
So I agree with Kevin's second point. I disagree with his first point. It's clear to me, as Kevin is saying, that sports analytics needs to turn some attention to questions of modeling competitive balance, modeling player mobility, best practices for league management, not just best practices for team management. I mentioned aggregate economic problems in the NHL before. I happen to believe that there's been a lot of mismanagement in the commissioner's office in the NHL, insisting upon teams in the Sun Belt, not allowing teams to move to cities like Seattle or Hamilton, Ontario, not doing anything to develop a league in Europe as perhaps part of a transnational league. I think there are a lot of opportunities in that league to expand revenues that would make a lot of the issues that get negotiated a lot less severe. Now, in terms of changing people at the bargaining table, I think that Kevin's right in a sense that it becomes complicated to do that, but it doesn't mean that it's always a failed strategy. We did it in basketball. Kevin and I overlapped in '05 working for the NBPA. I was doing that work for the NBPA in '98 when there was a long lockout that went into the middle of January of 1999. And the way we actually solved the strike, and by the way, during the course of, not the strike, the lockout, during the course of negotiations, we constantly were changing the people in the room. We would have situations where David Stern would meet Billy Hunter for lunch just to talk without all the pressure, because when they've got all their constituents around them, they behave a little differently. But the way the whole thing finally got solved is Stern and Hunter threw up their hands, is that we really, and Jeffrey Kessler, we're not getting anywhere. And they called Jim Quinn in from Weil Gottschall, who used to be involved in this stuff, and they called Russ Granick in, and they went and had a dinner together. And they're the ones who crafted the final agreement. So I wouldn't write off, it might not be the preferred strategy, you certainly don't want to rely upon it, but I wouldn't write off the idea that get different people in the room from time to time helps.
And you know, we don't have to be that formal or explicit, but you know, it's not like you have to lose your job and somebody else gets the job. Often what you need is different voices in the room that actually have some influence. And that you see much more often. You see that in business generally. The CEO or the president may be the person in charge of making the decisions, but if things aren't going so well, other people hopefully can speak up, or the board will come in and say, listen, we got to try something different. In the NHL as well, in 2004, 2005, what you see happening as the negotiations went on, and once the season was canceled, is that Bob Goodenow and Gary Bettman were playing relatively a smaller role, and Bill Daley and Ted Saskin were playing a relatively larger role. Not in the absolute sense, but now all of a sudden you're seeing the dynamic changing, not because somebody has to lose their job, because that creates this complication, but because you want a system that's not so reliant on one individual's personality. That's the word you used earlier, because that's a lot at stake on the basis of one person's strategy or tactic, and that might be not so wise. And that goes to your legal point as well. Sometimes bringing the lawyers in the room can actually be good.
I think 2 points I would make. I think one, getting the right people in the room is clearly important. And you know, you need to have a portfolio of people so you can find what works in a given situation. I think the problem with looking at it that way is you see the benefits without seeing the costs of having the switches. That you don't see the fact that people are then saying, well, given that we could change who's in the room and get a different, negotiate against somebody else, there's less incentive to make progress with the first group. And so I'm just saying, you got to be careful with an ex-post analysis that comes in after the fact and says, hey, this really worked, without realizing that feeds back on what happens in the first instance.
But keep in mind, that goes both ways. Sometimes the person is going to get replaced because they're being too nice. All right? So often the people, you know, and we were talking about ethnic conflict before this session, easier stuff than the stuff here. And what you'll find is that the negotiators who get shot usually get shot by their own side, not for being too aggressive, but for being too kind to the other side. So you're right.
Promising too much more often.
Right. So it can go in either direction.
Right. I think they promise too much, and that's one thing I think is critical that gets you into trouble a lot of times, is if you start the negotiations in a world in which there's not a lot of pressure to reach a deal, and most of what you're doing is sort of positioning yourself for your own constituencies. I think that can make it hard to ultimately get a deal. So you think, well, why don't we just start earlier? That's the way to get there. You know, if we're going to run 2 months into the season, let's start 6 months earlier so the deal gets done earlier. I'm not sure that works, because I think what ends up happening is you add a period of time at the beginning where there's not a lot of pressure to get a deal done, and then everybody really spends that time kind of trying to build as strong a position within their own constituency, which would make it harder to get a deal at the end of the day. So in some sense, I think often we can start too early rather than too late in terms of trying to get a deal done.
I'm going to try to bring a few of these points together and ask the next question. We've talked a little bit about who's in the room, and we've talked about different voices, and we've talked about, you know, what kinds of tactics are going to get us to make some progress. So as we think about the voices that aren't heard, we can think about the fans, we can think about other businesses that are related to the sports franchise, people whose jobs are on the line that aren't just players. As we think about all these folks, and we think about how many folks' livelihoods or salaries are on the line here who are not in the room? How do we think about a structure and a negotiation where those folks do get represented? So in negotiations, I tell my students, if we're doing a case on a sports negotiation, you don't have to be a sports fan to get at least one or two good insights out of any case. And for sports, I can tell you one right off the top of the session. If you see almost any negotiation in professional sports, a lockout scenario, a strike scenario, things have gotten tough, and eventually the sides realize they're going to have to make some concessions. What's going to be one of the first concessions that the players eventually make? All right, when it comes down to, all right, we're going to roll up our sleeves and do something we said we weren't going to do, what's the first concession they're going to make? Who are they going to sacrifice first? Let's put it that way.
The players not yet in the league.
The rookies.
Or those who are not
Right?
even in the
Yeah,
league, right?
the ones who are going to be rookies.
Right.
So rules surrounding rookies are often the first sacrifice made on the altar of negotiation. And the reason is simple. They're not there. Their voice isn't going to be heard. And there's an old saying that says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that is quite true in these situations. And so if we think about that dynamic, and you think about how negotiations progress, from day one, maybe we're starting too early, and as we start progressing, how do you see the voices changing? Or how do you see the players who are having an influence changing? Do the fans make any difference? All right, do the stadium owners, the other related businesses make any difference? Does the TV networks make any difference, or are they carved out in their contracts a sweet spot in case the deal falls apart? How do you see those?
Well, I think in the context of fans and the public, this is where government can play a role. This is where government could say, we will take away your antitrust exemption. We will do other things that make it more difficult for you to be profitable. We'll be less willing to finance stadiums and arenas. That those perhaps aren't immediate remedies, but they're at least a form of deterrent. Right now, leagues are able to do things, and players' associations, without great fear that they're going to lose. There's the Sports Broadcasting Act, which gives them an exemption from Section 1 of the Sherman Act for national TV contracts. Well, that's a pretty powerful piece of legislation. It's valuable to leagues. We could see Congress say, take into account the public, take into account the business owners, take into account all of these third parties who have no seat at the bargaining table. And your point, Deepak, about rookies and players not yet in the league, I think is a crucial point. That under labor law, unions can bargain on behalf of those not yet in a union. That is the law. I would argue, I think that's a law that should change. I think particularly in the context of sports, it's profoundly unfair that there are age restrictions and other eligibility restrictions that impact those who have a very short window of life to earn money, and where there are not alternatives to playing pro sports. Yeah, they can go to Europe and make 1/4 of what they would make in the United States. They can go to college where they will make 0/4 of what they would make in the NBA or NFL. And that these restrictions are anti-competitive and they're very prohibitive. I would argue that, and I was a lawyer for Maurice Claret in his case against the NFL. I'm completely biased about this, and I fully acknowledge it, but I think those rules are designed to benefit, obviously, the leagues because they're able to evaluate players over a longer period of time, and also veteran players who keep their jobs. Why should the union bargain on behalf of those not yet in the league so that the 12th guy on the bench can keep his job, or the practice squad player who's 4 years in can keep his job?
When there's free agent compensation for signing free agent and you get draft picks, it directly affects the salaries and the values of free agents. And you think even in that situation, today's union members shouldn't get to have any control over the way the draft is structured?
The draft, or I would say the draft structure is fine, but the eligibility for the draft is where I would argue. And in fact, I think it's fine to say that once you're in the league, there's a rookie wage scale. But just the eligibility rule, where the rule bars you from even being in the draft.
Okay.
Right? That's the
I agree.
distinction I would raise.
I agree.
And again, there's going to be a gray area where we draw the line. I mean, you're always going to be doing something that influences their outcomes down the line, but there is...
Who's primarily affected by an age limit?
That's totally relevant to the quality of the game, the quality of the product. I mean, survey any of the GMs, assistant GMs in the room, even any of the agents in basketball. The reality is we don't need more 18-year-old kids in basketball. If they can be 19, 20, we'd all take 20, 21, 22. Just bring us mature people who are ready so we can know whether they can impact our game or not. Because right now we're paying to find out. And taking enormous chances.
Why do you need an artificial restriction to find out? If in fact it's such a risk to hire an 18-year-old, then don't sign them.
That's
Wait
it.
till they're 19 or 20.
You have to, Andrew. You got to take your chance. You got to
Kevin,
go
you wanna-
after the talent.
You want to
gotta
tell us a
try.
little bit about markets that
Why should we
unravel?
save teams from
in
But,
this case?
themselves?
but what should we say?
I mean, let's face it, there's a tremendous, given the structure of the CBAs, particularly in basketball, you know, it's very profitable to get good young players. I mean, the rookie wage scale, you do any kind of performance pay relationship and you'll see that the top end rookies are a great deal. And that's not surprising. And it's true, the teams benefit by delaying, but they have to put that into the agreement because teams would, it's basically it's a commitment not to compete. And they would, they would cheat on that agreement if it wasn't part of the CBA agreement. Now, I'm not quite sure what we mean when we say we can't bargain on behalf of players who aren't in the league. I mean, you have to. I mean, you're going to sign a 5-year or 10-year, whatever CBA. That's going to have a great effect on people who are not yet in the league. I hate to think we'd have to do a new CBA every year for the guys who enter the league that year. That, to me, would be that would not be a solution to get
Well, no, that's
more
the point.
labor peace.
So I think that's the point, that there is a middle ground where anything you do is going to impact them. There's no doubt about that. And you're just trying to say maybe we're doing too many other things on top of it, which we don't have to.
But this is a good
That's your
example of what I was talking about before. I mean, have we really done a serious analysis of what an age restriction does? All the impact. People say, well, it helps teams put better players on the floor, whatever. We don't really have any analytics to really back up to say, does an age restriction make the league a better league or worse?
Yeah, that's true.
I tend to
I would
think
agree
it
with
doesn't. I tend to think I favor not having an age restriction. But can I really say I have the empirical evidence to support that the same way we have empirical evidence to support a lot of the other things people are talking about at this conference? I'd say no. I think it's mostly done on anecdotes. People trot out, well, the behavioral problems haven't been 18-year-olds. Other people trot out the bust contracts that we've had with high schoolers coming out, and other people trot out the great successes that we've had of people coming out of high school. But has there been really the analytics done to say one way or the other? I don't think so.
But just to be clear,
There
is the analytics
but
part
I
of it.
can trot out the reality of a decision-making process, which is we all agree the more information you have, the better. So the longer the college career, the better.
So we would have been better off if LeBron and Kobe and those guys had waited?
No, I agree. Somebody in here do a study, okay? Because that's a smart idea.
That's the problem.
5
The problem
years.
is
You got
there are
5
benefits
years to get
and
it done.
costs. There are benefits
There's
and costs
benefits
to
and
these
costs,
points, and they're large benefits and potentially large costs to these things. It's not a one-sided argument.
But just the way I was hearing Mike's point was, we don't know what the empirical answer is, what's best for the league. But I almost thought of it as, I don't know if I wouldn't call it ideological maybe, but just whether it's right to be negotiating on behalf of someone who's not there, even if it's better for the league. So we might want to think about both sides of those. Not only at the end of the day is the league better off, but were certain individuals made worse off along the way in order to make the league better off. And those need to be balanced on some level, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, but
That's
you
how
know-
it was decided back in 1972 with Spencer Haywood. People have rights. So you have to be pretty sure if
You
you're
heard it
gonna
here
approve
first, folks. People have rights.
And I think, I think, especially in leagues where, to me, the NFL restriction, even if there's a good argument for it, is the most troublesome because there are no alternative leagues. Brendan Jennings can go to Italy and do well. He actually didn't actually play that great over there, but he made a decent amount of money, and he came back to the United States, and he's gone on to have a very good NBA career, where there is this alternative profession. But in the context of football, there is nowhere else to play. And that, we saw that with a number of players this year, where there was talk of players thinking, well, it's unfair that I have to stay 3 years after my high school graduation to be eligible for the NFL draft. There are players who could play in the NFL maybe after 1 or 2 years of college. And yet the restriction, think about it, in a world of analytics, where we care so much about nuance and detail, we use a bright line categorical age restriction that doesn't take into consideration talent, that doesn't take into consideration the marketplace, that says, if you're not old enough, you're not in. To me, that's not sophisticated. This conference, the fact that we talk about, the papers that we've seen, the genius behind some of these papers, why don't we use some of that in drafting eligibility rules, where there probably is a better rule than a bright line, you have to be 19 plus 1, or you have to be 3 years out of high school to be eligible for the NFL draft. To me, there are better results than that, even if age restrictions on some level make sense.
All right. I'm going to transition the conversation a little bit back into the negotiation element, but now moving more specifically into what happens when you're actually in the middle of this negotiation, and now you find out that you're not getting an easy win. You maybe never expected it, but things are just getting worse and worse. And at some point, you're going to need to reach a deal. Whether it's because half a season is canceled or the full season is canceled, at some point, we're going to start playing again. From your own experiences, and I'm happy to take anybody on this one, from your experiences, what are the tactics or the approaches that you've seen that have been useful in turning the tide? You know, when you're in a downward spiral, the things that start moving things in the other direction. Is it just simply a mutually hurting stalemate, and then what happens? Right? So what are the kinds of things that you've seen that you think maybe would be useful for people to think about?
These guys have been in it.
Looking at the abyss, that's
I'll
what
tell
does
you,
it.
Looking into the abyss. is that what you said?
Looking into the abyss is crucial, but I think in baseball, we don't talk about baseball anymore. Baseball is the only thing we used to talk about in terms of labor unrest, and they haven't had any since 1994-95. But I think the main thing that changed in baseball was that Commissioner Selig figured out a way to get the owners to keep their mouths shut. They continue to hate each other. They continue to have disagreements. But Selig, through manipulation and through appeals and saying, guys, we're facing the abyss, he finally figured out a way to get them all on the same page, at least nominally. And that paved the way, together with improved relationships between Rob Manfred and Mike Weiner, to labor peace.
The combination is what's critical, because if you have unity among your owners, Gary Bettman had unity among his owners in 2004, and it led to disaster because he didn't have the second piece, which is, and now the representative actually has a good relationship. He can bring his side along, and he can communicate with the other side, right? So that's an and.
Right.
Absolutely,
That's pretty
'cause
important.
unity could go the other way.
Yeah.
I mean, although I think it's hard to get a deal when they're still fighting, so much fighting among one of the sides. I think that you got to get that resolved. So you need both pieces.
Right.
You need to work within your side and the other side
Yeah.
to get a deal. And
I mean, I just think, you know, from looking from afar in this last NBA negotiation, to what extent did the turmoil at the Players Association, I don't know if Kevin can comment, but you know, with Billy Hunter and Derek Fisher, the scandal that's now enveloped Hunter in terms of what seems to be pretty bad corruption. And granted, we haven't heard his side of the story, and we've only seen an internal report, so I don't want to latch on that that's the fact. But to me, it's pretty troubling that your executive director, if it's true, was doing things that would undermine your tactical position. And did the NBA know about this? Was the NBA able to exploit that? Again, these are questions that I don't know the answer to. But to me, I think it goes to accountability. It goes to ensuring that your leadership is not doing things that are undermining your position. And while I think some NBA owners probably weren't all together, I'm sure there was some disagreement, I don't think there were any allegations that there was corruption going on.
Tom?
Well, he said the abyss, right? Which is urgency. And the hardest thing in any negotiation at any level, in my limited experience, is to create an immediate sense of urgency unless it's really there, right? I mean, how do you get a trade done 2 days before the deadline? It's a really challenging thing to do, and you know it's the best deal. You know you're going to do it in a week, let's say, and trying to get it done earlier. But, you know, you can't manufacture the abyss. You just got to go there, right?
that's true.
Well, so you see the abyss, but then what actually happens then? So now you're looking at the abyss. It sucks. All right, it looks pretty dark. But something still has to happen next. And not like, oh, I saw the abyss, so now the negotiation is over. I mean, what actually changes after that? Is it people just soften their positions? Is it they start working harder internally? Is it that they start building bridges across? Do they start getting more voices? Do they start what? What's the next
I
step?
think you start playing more to getting a deal with the other side and stop playing so much to your own constituents. I think that ultimately happens, that you realize, you know, to get a deal, we're going to really have to look hard at what the other side's thinking. We can't just keep rallying our troops on our side to support our position. And you get to the point where you say, now it's time to really move forward. Now, when you get there, depends on how much uncertainty there is and how much disagreement there is. And, that's what made this one different than 2005. We started with a lot more heterogeneous views on both sides and between the two sides. I would have been very surprised if 2005 hadn't ended with an agreement. I think it was much more dicey in this case just because of where we started.
But it's a little, my guess is people in the audience are like, well, yeah, you should start thinking about the other person's point of view and stop just playing to your constituents and, do what you're supposed to be doing. Why does it take needing to look into an abyss? Because, as an economist, at some point, you've probably been with the, rational expectations model thinking, well, they know they're going to meet the abyss at some point.
But
why don't they just do it earlier?
No, but that's not, if you actually work out the economics, you are going to get into these kinds of situations. Because if you start reaching the deal earlier, and you say a week before I needed to make the deal, I made a deal. Well, somebody had to make a move that wasn't absolutely essential. They had to give in some way that wasn't really in their interest. So,
but they're going to do that anyway after burning some money. So it's not that you're not going to fall into that trap. That is an equilibrium. But you could find a better equilibrium if you coordinated with the other side earlier.
Why?
Why wouldn't
What tells you that you can get there? I agree. If we can sit down with each other and communicate well,
okay, there you go.
But that's not easy. It's not easy
Especially
to do.
not
Let's put it this
easy.
way. Let's agree. It's simple, but it's not easy.
That's the key.
Yeah.
The objective reality is that on one side, first the owner's side, you have very disparate teams. You've got the Los Angeles Lakers with a $150 million per year television contract in the second largest market with a great pedigree, a great history, and you've got the Charlotte Bobcats, and they're in the same league. And they together have to agree, how are we going to get the parameters of an agreement with the players in such a position that both of us could make out. And so the players, one way you could do that is to lower the salary cap from 50% of BRI down to 20%, but players aren't going to go for that. And so what inevitably becomes part of that negotiation is a negotiation between the Lakers and the Bobcats, between Buss and Jordan. How much money are you going to share with us? Because the players aren't going to accept a big hit like that. So until you can get one side to deal with their disparities in a new way, which they did. They were increasing revenue sharing by about 4 times in the NBA until you finally get those people to say, okay, here's what we'll do. You can't make a deal on the other side. Those are very deeply felt conflicts, deeply held conflicts that are there all the time. I think, going back to your original question, I think one of the things that they did in baseball in '94 and '95, and they've done it in this recent hockey agreement, is both sides realize that they need to have better communication. And what they do is they set up industry growth committees or revenue sharing committees where the players and the owners are together represented. So they learn to work with each other better. And another thing to do, which all of the agreements are doing these days, is to say, this is so terrible, we don't want to do it again for 10 years. And they make a 10-year agreement. In football, it's an agreement with no opt-outs.
Right.
In hockey, it's an opt-out after 8 years, in basketball after 6. But that's another way to say, we don't know how to do this very well, this collective bargaining, so let's not do it for 10 years.
Very good. Yeah. So as we think about projecting forward, right, and this is a lot of what, Kevin is hopefully paid handsomely to do, is to sort of think about what will happen when this plays itself out. Over 8 years, all the harder than, 8 years is great, we're not going to have to negotiate for a while, but trying to project where we're going to be in 8 years is pretty problematic. A while ago, Tom, you mentioned, well, one of the reasons these folks will fight for it is sacrificing revenue in the short run. Who cares? It's the long run we're winning. Except people get that wrong all the time. The owners thought that they won in 2005 in the National Hockey League, but they structured a deal that by the time they got to 2011, 2012, it looked like not so great to them, right? So as you think about trying to do a deal today that needs to work not only to, maybe the easy part is getting all your constituents to be willing to vote for it after this horrible process because you were able to look into the abyss. Now there is trying to project out even longer and longer years a deal that will work and not suddenly fall apart or won't make the next negotiation even harder. So as you find yourself in that position, because your job, I think, Kevin, some might say is not just to get a deal this time that works, but make sure that the next negotiation isn't all the worse because the projections were all wrong. How do you think about that? Does that get discussed much in those negotiations?
It does. Actually, if I look back at 2005, I think we had projections of where we would end up, and how it would evolve, and they turned out to be very close. I think what really changed was that deal was predicated on, the flow of cash flows weren't so great for the owners, but the league was growing, franchise values were growing, and a little thing called asset reevaluation that happened in 2008 hit the world. And that kind of made that deal, which had been a stable deal in the NBA for a decade, not so attractive to the owners anymore. That they felt like, geez, I can't live in this world in which the cash flow picture looks the way it does. And so I don't think it was that the deal didn't turn out, because I think 2005 deal ended up looking a lot like we expected it would look, very close. I think it was more the economy and other aspects that made for some owners say, look, I invested a lot of money in a franchise and I'm not seeing the prospect of looking as well in the future. And there was major disagreements between the sides on how you think about that and how that ought to shape the next deal. So I don't think it was not being able to forecast the deal. I think it was really external changes that caused the issues.
So Andy, you mentioned this earlier as well. It's when there is a shock, an economic shock, and you, I think, mentioned positive or negative, right? So if we're all losing money suddenly for some reason, now there's something to fight about. And we see that sometimes leagues, when there's suddenly a lot more money and they're growing, start fighting. It's these unexpected events that happen. In other businesses, when we're thinking about negotiations and deal making, one of the things we try to make sure we do is to ensure that the contract that we're putting in place or the strategy that's in place isn't just optimizing on our point estimate of what's likely to be the scenario in X number of years. We're sort of looking at the whole distribution and really playing out the scenarios. And what if this happens? And what if this happens? Are we still okay with it? To what extent do you find that happening in the sports negotiations? Are people really playing out scenarios, or is it still relatively short-term focus? We just got to get this deal done because our fans are ticked off. We haven't played any games. I mean, how much of a balance is there for that?
I guess I would say, I think people are trying to do that. And that's one of the things we tried to negotiate this last round, was a system that had the flexibility into it, that said if things grow well, this will happen. If things grow slowly, that'll happen. The problem we have is that the CBA, at least in basketball, has become so complicated, and it says so many interrelated parts that everybody's afraid to move anything for fear they have no idea what will happen if you suddenly change the rules dramatically. And I think we could do much better on CBAs by simplifying them and making them more adaptable. But it's very hard to do that. If we're going to do that this next time around, we got to start thinking about how you bring that about. We have to, again, gets back to knowledge. We have to understand how the system works today.
We're talking about 500-page documents, CBA. I'm sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, my brain is just to the basics. And, you talked about how things were working and everything was okay, and owners are making their money on franchise value appreciation when they sell it. And in my opinion, that's a big myth, because these are fabulously wealthy people who, if they put their money in their core business, it would appreciate much faster. That's their internal rate of return on how they invest money.
I agree, but they don't enjoy that nearly as much.
Okay, so there's that factor. But the fundamental reality in America, right?
This better be good.
Is you have the right to earn a profit if you operate well. Am I right?
No, you have the right to get what.
What's the best run team in all of basketball? Everybody say it. The Spurs. The Spurs are the best run team in basketball, unequivocally. We all know it, over the long haul. And they're in a situation with the old deal where they could not necessarily make a profit. And they should be printing money. They really should have the right to be able to print money if they're going to run that well for that long and be the epitome of the league. And the structure as it was set up wouldn't really even allow that. Break even becomes great.
But that's the market price. I mean, people are willing to invest in franchises at that rate of return, right? I don't see people giving these things away.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is
some have
leagues,
been
players,
given away.
There's a misconception that the players somehow control the rate of return. They don't. They control, they can affect the value of franchises, but the rate of return is going to be determined by the market. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we give a bunch of money back, that's going to make franchises worth that much more. People are going to have to invest that much more in their franchise, and it's going to look like they're not covering their rate of return again. Not determined by us. That's determined by competition to own franchises.
And us being the players, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, being the players. Exactly. I mean, it's like any other business. I mean, you know, there's a market out there, and that market is what determines those prices. And so we can make franchise values go up for sure. But once they get capitalized into franchise values, the rate of return's back to where it used to be. Otherwise, there'd be a bunch of guys running in to buy franchises. I mean, you got to support the equilibrium somehow.
I just wanted to touch on the point of there's a desire not to disturb such a complicated agreement. And I think we see some negative outcomes from that. We see in the NFL the personal conduct policy, which a lot of players are not entirely happy with. Had they had more time to negotiate a modified one where the commissioner isn't judge, jury, and executioner, maybe we would have not have seen the Saints in terms of the scandal with the bounty game. Maybe there are consequences that I think are low level, that they're not economic per se, and they don't rise to the forefront of collective bargaining. Drug testing, HGH testing. Is there HGH testing in the NBA and NFL? Well, they agreed to the concept of it, but they didn't agree to how to do it. Had they had more time to negotiate, maybe that would have been resolved. Now, we have seen other leagues address that. Look at Major League Baseball and the Players Association. They've been able to modify their drug testing, even though they're not in collective bargaining. Maybe that's a model that the NFL and NBA can use. But I do think there are outcomes because both Kevin and Andy mentioned, you don't want to disturb these complicated agreements. Well, some of them should be disturbed. And had they had more time, they would have done so.
Yeah, I don't want to say you don't want to. I'm saying people are reluctant
That's
to
what- yeah, that's
because
what I
they
meant
are
to say,
so
reluctant.
complicated.
Reluctant.
I think there's nothing more you'd want to do than disturb these complicated agreements if you really felt comfortable performing surgery on them. I mean, that's really the question is, who's comfortable getting out the knife and
If ever there was
performing
the right
surgery?
time to do that, it was this last cycle, because it was ripe for a totally new system, I think, in basketball, and we didn't go there.
Hopefully the next time.
I'm going to interject. We're going to get towards the Q&A now in just about 2 or 3 minutes. What I'd like to do is sort of put everything that we've talked about so far or thought about but didn't get a chance to say as backdrop and just ask a final question to everybody. And I don't mind who starts, but let's get everybody to answer. If you were going to give some actionable advice, and the key being actionable, so not sort of high level, hey, this is how, you know, be good, you know, or anything like that, to the negotiators or people who will be negotiating 5 years from now or 3 years from now or 8 years from now. Here's what you need to do, either now or in 4 years or when you start negotiating or when you're in the middle of it or when things go really bad. If there's one piece of advice I could give you, and you can give 2, but it has to be short, here's what I would suggest. And the audience will grade you on how actionable it is, much more than how good it is.
I'll
So,
start.
all right.
I think we need to get the knowledge we need to make a major revamp to the way the CBA works. And I think the reason we couldn't do it the last time is because we just didn't know enough about what it took to make the system work better.
So if we could come up with a sports analytics conference of sorts, where people could be motivated to do the heavy lifting and trying to figure out what exactly are the changes we would need that maybe expand the pie.
We need to get the agreement on what it is that makes, because you have to, you get that negotiations, you have to have trust. If you feel like they're just saying what they want because it helps them get what they want on another margin, you're not going to be confident that that's really what makes for a better system. So we have to really get a common understanding that, hey, this is what's going to make the league grow better and what to make the league better. If we can get to there, if we can make progress on that, then I think we can start changing these really complicated and I think overly complicated agreements we have.
Who's next? And you ready to go?
I'm
with what
going to second Kevin's.
on?
Nice and short.
Second, Kevin's, all right. Actionable, equally
say-
actionable. You get the same grade.
Totally change the focus. Why wait for 5 years to worry about negotiating, which is what we're talking about? Focus on growing the business. Focus on collaboratively working together to grow your sport, to grow that pie, to get more money from John Skipper and ESPN in the next negotiation, to sell more, to get new arenas, to the power of collaboration between these players and the leagues is what's being lost right now. And I think the NBA Players Association needs a leader who will focus on growing that business in collaboration. This is what happened in baseball. Business is good. MLB, BAM, is big time. That added so much value to everything, and that golden goose got fatter and bigger, and they all figured out a way to just keep growing with it. So In the interim, that's where I believe you can have cooperation. You can't have it until you get to, till you get to the compromise at the abyss,
So
right?
incidentally, not only will you get better outcomes from negotiating jointly against these other parties, but your own relationship might improve over the ensuing years if you're working together on these issues.
But you need a business leader with a business focus to work with, say, Adam Silver cooperatively to grow this thing over the next 5 years.
Are you that leader?
Sure, I'm ready. No, I'm not
But
that.
I think dovetailing on Tom, they shouldn't view collective bargaining as a one-shot, one-time event where it has to occur at the last second. We've seen in Major League Baseball where they've been able to reach agreements during the collective bargaining relationship, having a relationship where they're able to do trade-offs without waiting until the last second. That doesn't mean that by the end they're not going to have another lockout or strike. I get that. But I think they can mitigate some of the chance of that by having a collaborative relationship during the agreement and not viewing it as we have to go to war at the last second because we can't agree on these big issues. Deal with the small issues then. Deal with, and not that drug testing is necessarily small, but it's not an obviously economic issue. Deal with issues like that during the relationship. Don't punt until the last second. Don't punt on personal conduct policy until the last second, where it becomes a forgotten issue or where it becomes a, quote, they talk about B-level issues. Well, those aren't really B-level issues. They're important issues that affect players and teams, and I think they get shortchanged because the economics rise to the forefront at the end.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, we're going to take questions from the audience, and I think we have a format here where they've already been consolidated. And so I'm going to, let's just give me a second here. I'm sure I can read this. All right, we'll start the first one out, and I'm going to throw it to Kevin because it speaks to the point you were bringing up. Is there a way to use analytics to determine, quote, good contract parameters? I'm going to let you interpret the question in whichever way allows you to answer it in the most interesting way. But the idea is, if you can go a little bit further, then there is a need for more analytics to what are some of the parameters along which you think there might be some real leverage?
I think the biggest places, and I'll start with the end game, and then we can work back there to the contract parameters. I think a much more systematic study of competitive balance and the role it plays in league success. Closely related to that is the ability to build a team and keep it together. I think you run into systems that try to create competitive balance that run the risk of preventing people from building a team and keeping it together. I don't think that's conducive. I think, how much player mobility and team flexibility should you have? I think if we knew the answers to those questions, we could think about how to tweak the parameters a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't put it so much as we need to study the elements of the contract. Let's just study what it is we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. What are we trying to accomplish? Once we have that, I think we know how to change people's behavior. Teams act in very predictable ways, and they respond the way you would expect. This is one thing I've learned. When you change that CBA and you change incentives, teams respond, whether it's a cap, whether it's a tax, whether it's a trade rule, and they're really creative because they have very strong incentives to win. And you have to manipulate those incentives to win to get what you want to do as a league. Because wins are 50-50 at the end of the day, but it's the pursuit of winning and getting people to do it the way you want that tries to make the league worth more. So I think that's what we got to do.
Great. And you want to jump in that?
Yeah, so piggybacking on Kevin, it seems to me that there's got to be, on everybody's part, a better understanding of the underlying economics of the parts of the revenue streams of the leagues. One of the things that's happening right now that on the one hand is quite exciting, but on the other hand is portentous, is that there's an explosion in rights fees, for local rights fees for teams. We saw the Lakers at $150 million. The Dodgers are consummating a deal with Time Warner that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million a year. Everybody's looking at this, or a lot of people looking at it and say, this is wonderful, when is my turn? Now, there are two problems there. One is that teams that signed agreements, local TV agreements, 4 or 5 years ago, that were 15-year agreements, are going to miss out on this bubble that we're in. But another problem is trying to understand what's going on in the television market. Can we, in fact, expect that the trend over the last 2 or 3 years is going to continue? Or is it a bubble? Is it going to flatten out, or is it going to burst? We have to understand those things in order to develop our thinking about revenue sharing and competitive balance in the league. We don't want to just sort of sit around and wait for it to happen to us, but we want to anticipate. And to do that, we have to understand these markets better.
All right, I'm going to go to a different question here. So here's the question. In the NHL, attendance is up 3% over last year. I'm reading the question, so I assume that's true. Similar growth in 2006, which I believe is correct. Are fans to blame for prolonged negotiations? And I guess this speaks to the idea that there's all this talk about we're going to never watch again and you're going to boycott, and then the game starts and people are like, all right, pass the popcorn. All right, let's get going. Is it all cheap talk? I mean, do the fans always come back? Is that even a risk factor people need to seriously consider? Is there evidence that any of these conflicts, I mean, I know that attendance can vary for lots of reasons over time, but is there any reason to think that these conflicts are having
I may be wrong, but I thought in baseball after the strike, attendance was down for a while.
20%.
20, right. So I
for
mean,
1 year, did it come back or not?
Yeah, it came back. Well, you had Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa, and you had Cal Ripken, and it came back. It was the steroid era.
Yeah, so the solution, apparently, is where do you think they got the idea?
Attendance always gets talked about because it's published, but those aren't real numbers, right? I mean, those are published attendance numbers. What really matters is revenue and the actual people that show up and everything that goes with that, which is much more private and typically is much more impacted by these work stoppages. So you do, when you see the real numbers, see the impact in the short term, but fans do come back.
Yeah.
And you know, you hinted earlier, how do we get fans a seat at the table and all that? And look, the teams don't have a seat at the table. It doesn't matter. The opinion does not matter when it gets this big and this difficult and dramatic in terms of trying to get
You
people.
could imagine a thought experiment where fans come together and build their own union, and they somehow commit to not watching.
Hard to commit.
Oh, absolutely. But that's why it's a thought experiment.
That's why you see the short run response.
Right? And so the question
but not
is, yeah,
long.
is there any way for them to make their voice heard? That's what it comes down to. I mean, and there's another question. I'm just going to focus on that one only because it's in the same general area. As we think about these parties that are not at the table, there's a question here that says, with stadium subsidies often being paid back via a ticket tax, should government have a seat at the table, or municipalities have a seat at the table?
Yeah, that's all we need.
That's not going to speed solution. I
Right.
can
But again,
build for that.
let's interpret the question in a way that, well, you know, won't get laughed at, but actually is sort of going to yield some insight here. So, again, you think about these parties that are not at the table, but are influenced by it and actually are contributing to it. All right. So, and you'd already mentioned this, Mike, earlier, that government has the right to take away.
it can take away, right? It can take away
Because
legal
they've given
protections.
something, right? So I'm going to stop giving. Fans are going to stop giving. Folks can stop giving or change their behavior. Do we see any of these stakeholders, whether it's networks, stadium owners, or stadium subsidizers, or fans, that have managed to change their behavior over the last 20 years in response to the conflicts that are happening, or are they always destined to be on the outside
Look,
complaining
the
about
Sports Broadcasting Act was in 1961. It's still law, right? After all of these strikes and lockouts and all of these labor disputes, it's never been taken away. Look at the NCAA, all of the controversy about the NCAA. It still receives favorable tax treatment, among other benefits. That there's often this talk, and Congress will hold hearings, but when is there ever any action?
I really think we've done actually well in keeping the government out of this, because I think what is the more typical government response is that if you get in an impasse, we'll grease the wheels to try to get it. It's almost like they have the perverse response, which is, and this used to happen like in Chicago, where the union and the teachers union in the city would get, in the school district, get in a fight so they could get more money from the state. The last thing you want is to have the government out there saying, well, it's our job to prevent these strikes from happening, because I think you're going to get the reverse response that they're going to, in fact, inject money. And then the parties are going to say, well, geez, this is a conflict is a way to get more money out of the government. I'm really leery. I think that actually you'd get the reverse response. They're not going to punish you. Where's the area where they punish people for getting into disagreement? The banks got in trouble. We bailed banks out. you know, the government doesn't respond that way. They don't take this commitment like we'll punish you if you do something we don't want you to do. I would guess
Well,
they're
we
going to
have
go the
prisons.
reverse.
I mean, we do that. I mean,
Yeah, but do you think we do that when negotiations fail? Or are they much more likely to step in?
well, I think part of the problem is to
gotta be a-
define what a negotiations fail is harder
Yeah.
than you just shot that person. So
No, I agree. That's the problem.
Yeah.
But when negotiations fail, don't you think the government's much more likely to come in? Auto workers can't reach a deal with GM. You think they're going to come in and say, we're going to take money away from both you guys?
You're talking about a specific form of unproductive government intervention. It seems to me if sports leagues don't want the government involved, then they should stop putting their hand out. There are productive ways one could imagine that are less intrusive for the government to be involved. For instance, stadium funding right now, there's a national law, although it's closed some of its loopholes, it's been in place since 1986, that allows stadiums to be financed with tax-exempt financing. If Congress were to pass a law and said any league that has a work stoppage for 5 years won't be able to take recourse to this law and there won't be any tax-exempt financing anymore. That would be an unobtrusive way, I think, for the government to do something productive in this regard.
All right. We have 1 minute, or maybe zero soon, so we have half a minute. So I'm going to go over by 1 minute.
15 seconds.
So there is a question here which can't be answered in 1 minute, but is, I think, worth for people to think about as they walk out. What steps must be taken for both sides to trust each other before negotiations start and avoid these lengthy lockouts strikes? I find it useful only because fundamentally a lot of what we've been talking about isn't that a deal can't get done. They always do get done. The question is under what circumstances and after how long and with what cost to other parties. And one of the things a lot of you have brought up, in fact, maybe every one of you has brought up in some way, is this element of trust. Is when we say something to the other side, do they know that we actually mean it? When we're trying to be nice, do they not mistake it for being weak? Do we somehow find a way to start earlier without using that earlier period just to fight with each other? Do you folks think, and this is sort of more of a yes, no, and then you can put a little bit of color if you really want to on it, do you think in the years to come this is something that is likely to be improved, or do you think the status quo is going to remain? Do you think people are sort of understanding the cost of this, people are changing, the personalities might be being replaced, maybe the system is evolving in a way so that there is likely to be greater trust, or less trust, or about the same? Where do we see it happening?
I'll let Tom answer this one.
The answer is sure, yeah, it's entirely possible. It totally depends on the intent and actions of each leader and the willingness of those two to come together and work together and collaborate
there's
over time on issues.
So your answer is it's entirely idiosyncratic to the individual. So there's no trend we should be thinking about. There's no trajectory that we're on. It'll always depend on who happens to be the person.
I think we've answered this question, all of us. What we've been saying is that you want from the end of one agreement through the whole period of that agreement for there to be some collaborative process.
Some engagement.
That isn't, and both sides are trying to grow the industry. Some engagement, some cooperative committees where they're working together. It's always going to be more beneficial if in the league office or at the union office, they don't switch leaders right before a new negotiation happens. Now, football got, unfortunately, Gene Upshaw passed away just before, and they put in the new guy, D. Smith, and that was disruptive to the process. And it was probably nothing you could do about it, but you should, when you have the opportunity to do something about it, you should time the resignations of commissioners and time the appointments of union leaders so that they have a long time before the agreement has to be negotiated.
I'm gonna wrap this up. What you said, you know, that we've all talked about, there needs to be this process after the negotiation and before the next negotiation, I think is actually a pretty powerful one, albeit also simple, but not often done. There's a man by the name of Lakhdar Brahimi, who's been in the news recently, but some of you may know who that is. He's sort of a UN ambassador, diplomat, a jack of all trades, gets sent to the worst places on earth to try to make some headway in difficult conflicts. He was at Harvard University about 10 years ago, and during one of the Q&A sessions, he gave an answer to the question about diplomacy, where he said that an old British diplomat had once given him the following advice. Diplomacy, he said, is basically the following. You go to a country and you learn as much as you can about that country because you may have to negotiate with them in the future. And his point was you don't start negotiating when the bombs start falling. It's already too late. They're not going to be open. They're not going to answer your questions. They're going to be suspicious of everything you say. Everything that you say is clearly because of the conflict. And his point was you start negotiating well in advance, not to stake out positions, but to understand as well as you can. And I think the same is true in business. You know, we often talk to our students, we say, listen, don't start negotiating when there's a pile of money sitting on the table between the two of you, because all of a sudden that's what is going to be emphasized. If you're going to ask a question about what are your real interests, you're not going to get a real answer. So this engagement process, it's much better to negotiate a month after you sign the last deal than to negotiate a month before you're going to sign the next one, in terms of the level of trust you might even have the capability of building. And I think a lot of what everybody here has said is sort of works with that. I took the last word because I was given the middle seat for today, for no other reason. I appreciate the great insights that came from all the panelists. Thank you all for your time, and thanks for a great conference that's been set up here, and to all the organizers that made it possible for us to have this conversation, and for all the questions that came in. I'm sure some of us, maybe all of us, will stick around for a little while, and if you want to say hello to some of these folks or ask the questions you weren't able to, I'm going to volunteer their time for at least a few minutes. Hope you all had a good time.